We were at camp and we were having a great time at camp, except they had that minor rule about no bears, so poor Peter here had to stay home. But I hope you're able to watch last week's episode. It was a real quick one, but we're picking back up in 1 Samuel chapter 18, and Peter brought along a little help to remind us of what our last lesson was about. Our last lesson was about how Saul was trying to kill David. And as I was studying for this lesson, I just ended up writing at the top of my paper, Saul tries to kill David, continued. And then it came to be like parts 2 and so on. So we're going to continue, not with the javelin for today's story, but we brought that along to help remind you, boys and girls, what we talked about 2 weeks ago. We are in 1 Samuel chapter 18. And if you remember, boys and girls, David had killed Goliath, and part of the promise that Saul had made was that he would get to marry, that David would get to marry one of Saul's daughters. Well, it came time for that, and Saul says you can, and then he kind of breaks his promise, and we're not going to go through all of those details, but his one daughter, Michal, loves David, and David does want to marry Michal. Michal does want to marry David, and King Saul says that is fine, that is okay. So the first verse we're going to read is in 1 Samuel 18, verse 25. And Saul said, "Thus shall ye say to David, the king desireth not any dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines, to be avenged of the king's enemies." But Saul thought that to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. So instead of David giving money to King Saul in order to marry his daughter, King Saul thought up a plan, an evil plan. He thought, I will have David go kill 100 Philistines. If he kills 100 Philistines, surely he's going to get killed in the process. So King Saul thinks, I've outsmarted this. Well, David goes to kill them, and Peter, can you guess how many Philistines that David actually killed? Yeah, let's look, boys and girls, because it's not 100. Verse number 26. And when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law, and the days were not expired. Verse 27. Wherefore David arose and went, he and his men, and slew of the Philistines 200 men. Not just 100, he doubled it. He kills 200 men. And David brought their foreskins, and they gave them in full tale to the king, that he might be the king's son-in-law. And Saul gave him Michal, his daughter, to wife. So God is again looking out for David. David has just gone with his men. He's killed over 200 Philistines and reported back to Saul, and David gets to marry Michal. Well, that was another dangerous situation that David was in, and it continues on. We've kind of got lots of little stories in this section in 1 Samuel. Let's look at chapter 19, verse number 1. And Saul spake to Jonathan his son and to all his servants that they should kill David. What? King Saul still wants David killed. He hasn't accomplished it yet. He's tried with a javelin. He's tried with the Philistines. And now he says to Jonathan and all the servants that they should kill David. Do you remember, what is Jonathan's relationship like with David? Are Jonathan and David enemies, or are Jonathan and David friends? They're friends. Jonathan doesn't want to kill David. Jonathan loves David. So Jonathan's going to help David out. He's like, David, my dad wants to kill you. So let's look at a couple more verses here real quick. In verse number 3, it says, And I will go out and stand beside my father, this is Jonathan talking, in the field where thou art, and I will commune with my father of thee, and what I see, that I will tell thee. Jonathan says, all right, this is the plan. I'm going to go out in the field. I'm going to stand there with my dad. We're going to talk. We're going to have a conversation, and then I'll let you know what happens. This is what he tells David. So, sure enough, Jonathan and Saul go out in the field, and Jonathan's like, don't you remember? David's the one who delivered us from the Philistines. David's the one who killed Goliath, and Jonathan is pleading for David's case. And finally, Saul actually promises that he's not going to kill David. Verse number 6 says, And Saul hearkened unto the voice of Jonathan, and Saul sware, As the Lord liveth, he shall not be slain. He promises that he is not going to kill David. Jonathan's very relieved. This is his best friend. His best friend's life has been spared. And verses 7 and 8 basically tell us that things go back to normal. David goes back to the palace, and everything is fine there for them. Verse 8, David goes on to kill even more Philistines who are enemies of God's people. Boys and girls, we're going to see throughout the life of David, and especially right now in this interaction with Saul, that God is going to protect David over and over and over again. But who is David trusting in for his protection? If you remember back to David and Goliath, or the lion and the bear that he killed, David's trust is in God. Boys and girls, when we accept Christ as our Savior, that's a one-time decision. Salvation is one time. We have that assurance. But boys and girls, daily, when we come across things that are hard, things that are difficult, we have to choose to trust that God knows what's best for us. Even though sometimes it seems really hard, we need to trust that God knows what's best. One more thing I wanted to remind you of, because it came up again as I was studying, is at the end of chapter 18 and verse number 30, about halfway through, it says that David behaved himself more wisely than all the servants of Saul. David behaved himself wisely. If you watched 2 weeks ago, we pointed that out in verse 14, and it's repeated again, how wise David was in all that he did. Boys and girls, I hope this week that when something difficult comes up, that you'll remember to run to God in prayer, and trust him for all that's going on in your life. Have a good week, boys and girls. See you next Sunday.